welcome Mahmood Farooqui. Thank you so
Thanks,
much.
I'm here to speak about Dastangoi, the revival of Dastangoi. This talk is going to be resolutely unscholarly and unacademic. So I hope those of you, thank you. It's just the story of Dastangoi, and basically, as they say in Urdu, a charba of the work of Shamsul Rahman Farooqui. Which as considering that he's my chacha, continuing the chacha bhatija tradition of India, this is all right, So Dastangoi, the revival of Dastangoi, Urdu storytelling in history and practice. The word Dastangoi refers to the art of storytelling. It is a compound of two Persian words, Dastan and Goi, which means to tell a Dastan. Dastans were epics, often oral in nature, which were recited or read aloud, and in essence were like medieval romances everywhere. Telling tales of adventure, magic and warfare, Dastans mapped new worlds and horizons, encountered the unseen, and protected the hero through many travails and lovers as he moved on his quest. The hero's adventures could sometimes parallel the mystic quest. At other times, the story narrated a purely profane tale. In the process of telling the story, the narrators freely borrowed tropes and themes from other stories. Thus it was that Rumi's Masnavi and Arabian Nights both came to contain many stories from the Panchatantra tradition. While Dastans had many principles and many stories, the story of Hamza began to stand out early on. Beginning with an unknown Arabic version, the Persian versions of the story narrated the life and adventures of Amir Hamza, supposedly an uncle of the Prophet Muhammad. Marked out by fairies, jinns, and prophecies, Hamza travels to different lands in his infancy, and even as a young child shows great physical prowess and daring. His fame spreads far and wide, and he is called by the chief minister of the king of Persia to aid the latter in his troubles. Thus, encountering many adventures, beings, species, and realms, Hamza remains triumphant and unvanquished right to the end. By the 16th century, versions of the Hamza story had begun to circulate in India. Mentioned first in the Deccan courts, the story reached its artistic apogee in the court of the Emperor Akbar. By then, specialized tellers of the story, called Dastangos, had emerged. There is scant information on what the ingredients of their art were, but they were sufficiently distinct to merit a separate genre for themselves. Akbar himself was exceedingly fond of the narrative and used to recite it sometimes himself. One of the first artistic projects commissioned under him was an illustrated version of the Hamza story, which became known to posterity as the Hamza Nama. It was a mammoth artistic undertaking, which consisted of over 1,200 folios, each at least 1.5 yards by yard in size, making it an unusual picture project with the text inscribed at the back. Nothing of that size, ambition, or scale was ever attempted again by the Mughal regime, attesting to the importance of the Hamza story in the medieval Indian imagination. Some scholars have conjectured that the large size of the panels indicates their use as a kind of an audio-visual storytelling. The narrators would stand behind the panels and narrate the story from the text, and the panels would be changed as the story progressed, envisaging it as a form of proto-television. I showed these images yesterday. I'll just play them again, just to give you an idea. So there were 1,200 of these, and now only about 100 survive. I think there's 2 in India. There is some in Vienna, and there's some in America. And these were really large panels. I haven't seen them yet myself. A few years ago, the Viennese Museum did a collection, did a presentation of it. Oh, sorry, this is I got the wrong panel there.
Mahmood, can we ask you questions, or you want to wait?
Yeah, I mean, you can ask me questions, yeah.
Have you ever used images in your...
No.
That was a yes or no question.
Yeah, so just... I would love to have, if I get one of these images, I'll certainly use them, So, but, the amazing thing is that we don't actually know, we only know the text that is inscribed at the back. So the catalog of these paintings describes the texts that were written at the back, but we don't have a complete text of the version on which this was based, So the first Hamza, the Persian version of the Hamza story also actually comes from India, as do many of these stories. I mean, the Arabian Nights is first published in India in the English translation as well. So I would love to, so I can't tally them to the work, the stories that I have and these images do not concord with each other. But they still give you some idea. I mean, this is, for those of you, that's Amar Ayyar. This is Amar Ayyar. He is always, accoutred with all these Ayyari ke tana bana. And they were really big, in size. So I'll stop it there, and you can go and look at that later on. For the next 2 centuries after this, different Persian versions of the Hamza story circulated in India, with occasional mention of the Dastangos who performed them. There were at the same time other Dastans, sharing tropes and conventions of the Hamza narrative, which in their emphases begin to differ from the Persian versions of the narrative. Bostan-e-Khayal, in 18 volumes, composed at the end of the 18th century, enhances greatly the role of magic in its telling of a fantastic tale. Given primacy too is the art of ayyari, trickery, a relatively neglected feature in Persian storytelling. The first Urdu version of the Hamza narrative was published at the beginning of the 19th century under the aegis of the Fort William College, an institution established by the East India Company at Calcutta, which was the first to edit and publish some of the key texts of the North Indian literary tradition. Alongside the Dastan-e-Amir Hamza, other Dastans were also published by the college, which included Mir Amman's Bagh-o-Bahar, a tale that was reprinted over 20 times in the 19th century and one which is taught to this day in the syllabi of Urdu literature. Bagh-o-Bahar was selected by the colonial administrators as a text which, with suitable emendations, was fit to be used to learn the native languages, a status that was not accorded to the Hamza story. As print came to North India in the middle of the 19th century, stories, fables and dastans proved to be the most important motor for the print revolution alongside religious literature. Until the middle of the 19th century, tales such as Betal Pachisi and qissas such as the Qissa-e-Hatim Tai were printed many times over. Until the middle of the 19th century, however, the Hamza tradition in Urdu was thriving more as an oral performance tradition rather than as a successful print commodity. While Dastangos at Rampur, many of them migrants from Lucknow, were committing the narrative to paper, it remained in manuscript form. But already the stories were expanding. While very few Persian versions exceeded a single volume, the Urdu manuscripts had begun to extend to several volumes. Acquiring primacy too were new areas in the story, the tricksters and the magical and wondrous worlds created by sorcerers, pretenders to divinity many of them, which in their colourfulness, imagery and fancifulness were like nothing seen in Persian literature. By the middle of the 19th century, the practice of Dastangoi in North India was sufficiently entrenched. In Sir Syed Ahmad Khan's ethnographic account of Delhi, Asarus Sanadid, Dastangos are mentioned prominently. Every Thursday they are said to gather at the steps of the Jama Masjid where they recite their tales. It is quite interesting that the mosque should be the site for a profane storytelling, for the Quran specifically mentions poets and storytellers and asks the believers to be wary of them, for they mislead with the magic of their words. And given how central whining and carousing is to the Dastanic tradition, I would love to find myself at the Jama Masjid of those days, Mirza Ghalib, the famous Urdu poet, was exceedingly fond of the Hamza Dastan, and for a period of 2 years, he used to organize weekly performance sessions at his house in Delhi. He composed a long poem using characters and tropes from the Hamza story, and once wrote in a letter to a friend that it was raining, and he had just acquired 6 chapters of the Hamza Dastan and 16 casks of wine. What more do I want from life? The upheaval of 1857 turned out to be a boon for Lucknow, as thousands of artists, poets and writers migrated there from Delhi, and this included several Dastangos. The first modern historian of Lucknow, Abdul Halim Sharar, wrote in Guzeshta Lucknow about the proliferation of the art of Dastangoi in the city after the uprising. Every nobleman, he said, had made it a practice to employ a Dastangoi in his retinue, as chowks or city squares became a favourite site for the performance of the art. Sharad defined it as the art of extemporaneous composition and said that it rested on descriptions of 4 phenomena: war, romance, trickery, and magical artifices. The Dastangois in Sharad's time, therefore, were not reciting a story learnt from memory. They were improvising on the bare structures which had been handed down to them. Simultaneously, after the uprising, the Hamza story began to enjoy great currency in print as well. While the Fort William version had already been reprinted several times, Munshi Nawal Kishore, the legendary publisher from Lucknow, commissioned another edition of the story, one which, with minor changes, continued to be printed for an entire century and was last published in 1969. Persian versions of the story were also being printed at the same time. By that time, conventions of the Dastans were beginning to affect productions of modern prose works in Urdu. Fasana-e-Azad, supposedly the first modern novel in Urdu, is structured like a Dastan as the picaresque narrative meanders from country to country. At the same time, the tremendous success of the Parsi theatrical production in Hindi and Urdu, interspersed as it was with song and dance, like the Dastans, also had a give and take relationship with Dastans. Both were tied to the commercial print revolution too, as songbooks of stage performances came to be printed, exactly as Dastans created in oral performances came to find a new life in the print form. In 1881, buoyed by the success of the Hamza story, Nawal Kishore embarked on a highly ambitious literary print project. He assembled some of the leading Dastangois of Lucknow and commissioned them to produce the entire Hamza narrative as it existed in oral and written records. The team of 3 writers, Muhammad Hussain Jah, Ahmad Hussain Qamar, and Sheikh Tasadduq Hussain, joined later by others, started work on reproducing in print the virtual entirety of the Hamza tradition. The result, by the end of a labor of 25 years, was a series consisting of 46 huge volumes, each about 1,000 pages long. Each of the volumes could be read as an independent entity, or one could read it as part of the whole. We have very scanty information about the exact mode of reproduction or production followed by these narrator authors. Although they repeatedly claim to be basing their rendition on pre-existing texts, often in Persian, and ascribe authority to august figures of antiquity, none of the previously existing versions they quote can be found. It is a reasonable guess that the expansion of the story from a single volume to this mammoth series was a creation mainly of the performative tradition. They were circulating in the oral realm as the Dastangois improvised and expatiated upon them, which may have rested on written records in the form of key or guidebooks which outlined the main characters and the run of the plot, but the body was supplied by the narrator as he recited the story. We don't even know whether these Dastangois dictated the stories and they came to be written by scribes, or whether they actually wrote it in their hands. We have one story about one of these, Ahmad Hussain Qamar, dictating to 6 scribes simultaneously versions of the story, different Dastans, and so he's like 6 scribes are sitting there, and he finishes a sentence there, and the next sentence there, next story there, next story there, next story there, and comes back there. So this is obviously, these are needless to say, the prodigious feats of memory are involved in this, and Farooqui has written a lot about that. While the Hamza story was performed and recited in many parts of the Islamic world, in places as far as Morocco and Indonesia, in most other places it was part of a musical storytelling tradition. Alfred Lord and Milman Parry, in the course of their investigation of the Homeric bardic tradition, studied the Hamza singers of Bosnia and produced a groundbreaking work called The Singer of Tales on the oral tradition. But the narrators they worked with also used musical instruments. The Indian Dastangois, by contrast, relied purely on words and their art of narration to tell a story, aligning it closer to a literary performance. The 46-volume Hamza Dastan is the crowning glory of Urdu performative literary tradition and the summit of 1,000 years of Indo-Islamic storytelling tradition. The sheer fecundity of the Dastans, with thousands of invented names, tools, weapons, beings, with an overflowing vocabulary, as also its immense popularity had a long-lasting effect on other forms of narratives. The Dastanic tradition appropriated revered figures of the Islamic past into a profane narrative. Its treatment of themes like humor, body, macabre, eschatology, seduction, wining, and dining are all of a time when public tastes and culture in India had not been transformed under the colonial imperative. For sheer literary virtuosity, for its treatment and range of linguistic tenors, its use of metaphors, similes, and all the other conventions of literary and poetic creations, the Dastan of Amir Hamza is an outstanding achievement. While it deals with the fantastic is grounded in the real and the social. So it has also been seen as a remarkable social document of the pre-colonial order. While the literary trappings appeal to highbrow minds, the content of the stories, replete as they are with tales of seduction, competitive magical encounters, and confrontations between tricksters and magicians, could appeal to uninitiated audiences too. As S.R. Farooqui, among others, has shown, Urdu literary culture and its values were recast fundamentally at the end of the 19th century by a group of reformers who looked down on the artificial and the conceited works of Urdu writers. Seeking to yoke literature to social reform and emphasizing purity of thought and simplicity of style, Urdu's leading critics of the 19th century privileged truthful experience rather than exaggerated inventions. Desirous of mirroring Western, more particularly Victorian literary values, they praised moralistic and realistic fiction and long narrative poems. Dastans by then were already an object of religious censure. Women particularly were advised against reading them because it would corrupt them. At the same time, colonial officers often found Dastans to be immoral and obscene. Added to this was the growing contempt of Urdu's own critics, who found Dastans to be childish, inconsistent, implausible, and too repetitive. The only permissible fictional form for the reformers was the novel, and the Dastan was a veritable anti-novel. Although Dastans continued to be published into the middle of the 20th century, their popularity was clearly waning. Many of its conventions had passed into cinema. The oral culture of which it was a product was giving place to a literary culture, and the spaces where it was traditionally performed were being recast. In 1928, just a few years before sound revolutionized the Indian film industry, Mir Baqir Ali died. He was the last famous Dastangoi of India. The connection is not merely incidental. Reports of his performances establish beyond doubt that he was perhaps the last great traditional actor to be born in this country. He never told Dastans, as is one pen sketch of him. He presented lively, moving pictures, or rather you could say that he himself became a picture. He was a thin, slightly built man, but while he was reciting the Dastan, if a king appeared in the story, the listeners felt themselves standing before an imperious monarch. Sometimes, if he spoke the words of some old woman, he adopted the very style of speech of respectable elderly ladies, and even despite his teeth, became quite toothless. He knew thousands of verses by heart. He had such a command of languages that poets and writers accepted Mir Sahib as an authority. Before he died, Mir Baqir Ali did a 3-minute audio recording with George Grierson when the latter was compiling his great linguistic survey of India. Unfortunately, we have that recording. That's the only evidence, only thing we have about when I started doing Dastangoi, I had no clue at all about how it was done, who did it, how they spoke, how they talked. So this Mir Baqir Ali recording came to us 2 years ago, thanks to the work of, thanks to Shahid Amin, who managed to get it online. And so you may not fully understand this. He's narrating a story about a diwana, a pagal, who hears in a group, he's sitting in a mehfil, and there are people talking, and they talk about sasural, which is, where your in-laws' place. So he goes home to his mother and says, Amma, I also want to go to sasural. So the mother says, this guy is mad. I mean, what to say to him? So to fob him off, she tells him, okay, keep walking straight and you will reach your sasural. So he starts walking straight and then he comes against a date tree. So he doesn't know what to do, how to continue walking straight when there is a tree. So he climbs the tree in order to, go down and further. But when he climbs the tree and then he slips, so he's like hanging by. And then he sees that this camel driver coming, and he asks the camel driver to help him. So the camel driver comes there, and the camel driver holds him in between, during which, the camel sees something and moves below him. So then some other rider comes, and so finally, so like 3 people hanging there, and finally an old man comes on an ass, and he says to the old man, you have to help me. So the old man also now is hanging there. Now the pagal who's hanging on top, the diwana, he says ki, now you must tell me a story, otherwise I'll leave my hands and you'll all drop to the ground. So they start telling a story. So ek aadmi kahani sunata and one guy plays the tabla and the other guy is doing this. So the pagal, really enjoys the story, and he enjoys the story, he claps his hand, So he claps his hand and they all fall down, So when they all fall down, then he says, he rubs himself, rubs his clothes and says, oh, Sasural may be a great place, but there's a lot of hardship on the way. I'm not going there. So it takes a while to get used to this. So that's why I just thought I'll tell you.
Grierson's voice?
No. Yeah, this is great. No, I think this is his assistant's voice.
Okay.
Yeah. So this is actually a history, you can hear history in this,
A story in Urdu, spoken by Bakir Ali at Delhi, 25th of April 1920. एक रही ज़्यादा है दीवाना, बरसात का ज़माना है, एक रोज अपने बाराखाने पर होता है कि उस वक्त बारिश थमी, बादल फटा, आसमान साफ साफ निकल आया, वो आधी रात निखरी निखरी चांदनी, छिटके छिटके तारे, धुरा धुरा आसमान, ठंडी ठंडी हवा, कोसों का मैदान और उस चांदनी में बालाए हवा, नदी का सुहाना सुहाना जोर, नदियों की आवाज, बरसेले पानी बहने की खलखलाहट, शहर में सन्नाटा की जगह इसके कान में गाने की आवाज आई। ये बाहर निकल आया, जब बाहर निकला तो देखा कि एक दरवाजा है बहुत बुलंद वाला। ये अंदर गया तो देखा इसने के वहाँ नाच हो रहा है, दंगल पिछले जिन पर बड़े बड़े पहलवान खोद पोलादी सरों पर उस जमाने के हथियार, कत्ता खाना शमशीर सरोही सैफुद्दीन जा खंजर कतार से सब चक्कन कमर फरोली, जबू नैदा बच्ची तेरे शराब से तैयार हैं कि आपस में तस्करा हो रहा है। एक ने कहा भाई ससुराल बड़े मजे की जगह है। पागल ने सोचा हम तो गए नहीं, कि घर आया और अपनी माँ से कहा कि तुमने हमें ससुराल नहीं भेजा। इसने कहा बेटा तुम तो दीवाने हो, अक्लमंदी की बातें करो तो ससुराल भेजे। इसने कभी हम तो डूब मरेंगे। इसकी माँ ने कहा बेटा तुम अपनी नाक की सीट में चले जाओ, गरज ये कि शहर से निकल के बाहर पहुंचा। अब ये चला जाता है कि सामने से खजूर का दरख्त नजर आया। इसने देखा कि लो भाई गजब हुआ, नाक की सीट में आ गया खजूर का दरख्त, आओ भाई इस पर चढ़ो। गरज ये कि चढ़ा, उतरता था कि पत्ते तो हाथ में रह गए, पाँव लगे लटकने। अब घबराया कि क्या करूँ। इत्तेफाक से एक पहलवान हाथी पर सवार कमाल जबरदस्त चला आता है। इसने आवाज दी कि भाई पहलवान जरा पाँव पकड़ो। गरज इस पहलवान ने हाथी खड़ा कर अब जो ऊंचा हुआ तो जस करके पाँव तो पकड़े मगर हाथी निकल गया। अब इसने कर ये क्या गलत किया। अब इत्तेफाक से सानवी सवार चला आता है। इसने आवाज दी भाई सानवी सवार जरा जल्दी आना। चुरा के सानवी सवार आया, सांडिये पर खड़ा होके पहलवान के पांव पकड़े थे कि उधर से हाथी आया, सांडिया भी डर के भागा। अब इत्तेफाक से एक जोन चला आता है, कोई 80-85 बरस का सिंपुच्छा आदमी, मुंह में दांत नहीं। इन्होंने आवाज दी मियाँ बड़े मियाँ गए यहाँ आना। ये बुढ़ा तो इसने तो तमाम मुझे को माधुकी से मैं तो बुढ़ा आदमी हुआ ना होकर जरा हमारे पाँव पकड़ ले। गलत देके इसने पाँव पकड़े। पागल ने देखा भाई बड़ा बोझ है, चक्कू इसके नीचे से तुरंत मार के निकल गया। अब इसने पागल ने कहा या तो कोई चीज दाओ नहीं हाथ छोड़ता हूँ। ये लगा गाने, सानवी समाज ने सारंगी बजाई, पहलवान ने तबला। पागल ताल देता था कि ऊपर नीचे किसी की कुर्सी किसी की पसली। पागल था सबसे ऊंचा कूदा और भागा, कान पकड़ा कि भाई ससुराल में आराम होगा, लेकिन रास्ते में बड़ी खराबी है, हम तो नहीं जाएंगे।
So this really is for me my Quran in a sense. This is the only I have of a traditional performer, and I'll talk about this later on. But obviously there is there is a voice technique here, and there is a voice technology here, which we can't reach, because it's just not just because it was honed by years of practice, but it was worked. It was his practice consisted of it's a pre-loudspeaker voice, pre-megaphone voice, so it's a different kind of it's much more a voice exercise than the work that we do. I'm going to come to that. So herein lies one of the greatest conundrums of our cultural history. A thriving oral form becomes a literary form and is so successful that the practice generating those texts is gradually erased. At the same time, the texts themselves, a little later on, drop out of public memory over time, leaving only a trace of the tradition behind in the form of the popular 8 volumes of the Tilisme Hoshruba, which can still be found. Over time, the genre became so neglected that today the Dastane-Amir Hamza has completely receded from public consciousness. Few critics have engaged seriously with it. Few Urdu students read them. And in fact, the entire set of the 46 volumes can today only be found in 2 or 3 collections in the world. I have one collection, I've written one collection here, but since yesterday I was given the 3 DVDs which have the entire 46 volumes by this collector here in Michigan called Dr. Sarosh, that I have to modify that, So while their neglect as literature is inexcusable, they've also been wholly obliterated from the canon of performing arts. As anecdotes of Mir Baqir Ali make clear, their performance required an exceptional command over rhetoric, delivery, mimicry, ventriloquism, and spontaneous composition. Moreover, Dastangoi was one feature of an oral performative culture where the public arena was the first and perhaps the most natural site of performance. Qissa goes, contortionists, soothsayers, bhands, bhagats, faqirs, magicians, madaris, animal fights, mushairas, and sundry other activities provide a prismatic context in which dastans were composed and performed. The Dastango's skill as actors lay in commanding the audience's attention at all times, an audience that in the case of a public performance was likely to fritter away at the slightest drop of intensity. This demanded acting and performing skills that ranged from drama to dance to mime to performance art. Rather than occupying a central place in our artistic heritage, it's strange that they have been consigned to complete oblivion. Prompted by the Colombian scholar Francis Pritchett, the great Urdu critic S.R. Farooqui first started collecting dastans in the early 1980s. He found the volumes dispersed all over the world, many of them difficult to trace. Finally, in 1998, he published the first volume of his study of the tradition. He analyzed the stories, set out their rules, explained the importance of orality in their creation, and arraigned Urdu critics for their grievous neglect of the form. It was S.R. Farooqui who drew my attention to the genre and to these stories. I had studied history, had done an MPhil about aspects of early Urdu literary culture, was very fond of Urdu literature, and had been a theatre director, but I had never heard of the word Dastangoi. I had also not read any of the Dastans. I read Farooqi's masterly book with great interest and decided to make a documentary on the form and its history. During the course of a fellowship at Sarai, which is the Center of Study of Developing Societies, New Delhi, I was asked by the then director at the India International Center to give a lecture demonstration on the form. It was while devising the lecture demonstration that I first explored the possibility of actually performing the text. The best way to demonstrate its prowess at that time, it seemed to me, was to actually let the text speak. Traditional Dastangoi was restricted to a single performer. The innovation I made was to rope in another actor so that we would alternate our recitations and participate as listeners to each other's stories. Due to the neglect of the form, we had very little information about the actual practice of the art. How did Dastangos sit? How much did they move around? What were individual stylistic feats? Did they take breaks during performances? How was audiences arranged? Did they sing out the poetry? None of the things were very clear and are still unclear now. Working closely with Farooqui Sahab and drawing on our experiments as theatre actors, we devised our way of putting together a 1-hour show. So the first modern Dastangoi performance took place on 4th May 2005 at the India International Auditorium. There were a lot of Urdu writers and journalists, apart from some theatre goers and the members of the India International Center. From the very beginning, the descriptions, this is the same story that I did yesterday. I opened with that story. From the very beginning, the descriptions began to evoke a spontaneous wave of enthusiasm from the audience. Soon enough, the hall was swinging to wahwahis, and we were borne aloft in this vocal and passionate response to our presentation. What was brought amply home was the vitality of their texts and their ability to regain contemporary audiences. Since then, nearly 500 shows in several cities in India and abroad have taken place. Altogether, some 20 people have joined me on this journey. We've now taken out a book of the performed stories in Urdu and Hindi, and we hope to continue working with more people and newer stories. The present-day revival of Dastangoi is in fact not a revival at all. It is a reinvention to a certain extent of the art of Dastangoi, even its reincarnation. As it is, we have very scanty information about the practice of Dastangoi. All we have is the texts produced by the practice, texts which must have been honed over generations and decades. So we do not know much about the way it was practiced at its zenith. Whereas the traditional performers performed at salons, gatherings, and sometimes in public spaces, we mostly perform in auditoria or similar proscenium spaces. The traditional art rested mainly on recitation. Our performance requires lighting and sound system, and so that our faces, our eyes, and our expressions become equally important. In the past, it was a solo performance, whereas now it requires two performers. But most critically, in the past, the audiences knew the stories and the language of the stories beforehand. They were always already familiar with all the tracks, so each new episode could be tagged to the assured or assumed knowledge. When we perform now, we have to reacquaint the audience with the entire tradition, in a very pressy form, of course, and then relate the story. The story, like poetry, does not stand alone, but in a dialogue with all the stories that have gone before it. It is a bit like telling an episode of the Mahabharata to an audience which knows nothing about the epic. Most importantly, the older Dastangos assumed that the audiences understood their language, an assumption that does not operate in our times. We are left then to relating strange stories in a strange language and in a strange form. As a general rule, people who know Urdu do not come to the theatre, and those who come to the theatre do not know Urdu. Who watches us then, and why? And can our performance be defined as a form of theatre? Comprehensibility of our performances works at several levels. When we perform, we have to make sure we are illustrating the action with the use of gestures, voice, and expressions. The audience may not understand every word in a line, but as long as they are willing to go with the tone, we are fine with it. Lack of Urdu does not always result in a standardized response. One person may want to persist in spite of the difficulty of words and be rewarded by the joy of the story, and another may give in too easily to the strangeness and say, I don't understand this at all. In selecting stories from the oeuvre, we must choose the humorous ones, that which can regale and entertain the audience. We can't afford to delve into a 10-page description of a garden or sing out the musical wars between dhobis and bhishtis. So I'm just going to demonstrate what I mean by the fact of illustration. It's when even when you begin with a poem or a description or anything, so the gesticulation tries to create a kind of a visual picture, which is basically, I'm unsure of whether the audience is getting it or not, but hopefully when we are talking about Mehri-Taba and I point to the sky, so the sky has the earth and the moon and the stars or something, so at least some kind of a elemental presence is invoked, We had it all sorted till yesterday, but as these things happen, Yeah. It was working till before you guys came. I mean, I don't know what you've done. And this is, no, maybe there are these. I think the Irani storytellers trying to thwart us Indians again, you know. Just playing 10 minutes ago, you know.
Try with Windows Media Player.
No, it's been what's happened to this. I don't know what's happened to my icons as well. Something, you know. We have it on a pen drive, so yeah.
Never mind. Just try opening it with Windows Media Player. See if it works.
Oh.
Right click on the VLC thing and shut it down first. On the icon of the status bar in the system tray.
The VLC is not responding.
So, do you want to try this in your computer? See if this
No, anyway, if this doesn't work, I'll illustrate it.
Open view picture. Should just say open.
Here, I'll just try something.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry. Respond in a second. It should work. Sorry.
Yeah.
Don't delete me yourself.
Yeah. Well done. Yeah, virtues to doing science after all. No. No, Sanju, let me just try this playing for once last time on this, you know. I think there is some problem with the VLC player, you know. Okay.
That one won't close down.
You could log out
Do you want to continue your talk
Yeah.
and I'll get somebody
Yeah,
from IT?
yeah. They've destroyed my computer as well, you know. Because it's not playing from the pen drive either. Anyway, so I'll come back to this. If it doesn't work, I'll illustrate this. You'll get a little, I'll perform a bit, you know. So, What of language itself? These stories are told in an ornate language. They could be highly Persianized or highly colloquial, but in either case, it is unlikely to make sense to today's Indian audiences. Why persist with the difficult and, in a sense, anti-democratic language? We persist with them for the moment for various reasons. The stories created by the master tellers in the language they chose are their work. When we are using their work, we cannot simply separate their language from their content, their form from its casing, so to say. Moreover, even if irregularly understood, it is still beautiful and beautiful to hear. There is an oral quality to languages which needs to be center staged in today's visual culture. Moreover, in India, for the past 60 years, Urdu has faced a relentless pressure, even a command to simplify itself. Everyone, everywhere, qawwals and poets included, feel the need to gloss what they are saying. By refusing to submit to this diktat, we are asserting Urdu's right to be and giving the audiences a taste of language which has been denied to it everywhere else. The language has been marginalized and even emasculated, and we do not want to participate in that. We want to assert that this is a beautiful language. If you don't understand it, it's your loss. It is the creation of a politics of longing for a language. At the same time, we resist the demand to become more contemporary, to do topical stories. A story and a form that has been marginalized due to cultural politics acquires political overtones when done in the present. Our work is an act of cultural contestation, and when we perform lost stories in our times, they ipso facto become topical and contemporary. We do not have to tell stories only of starving workers or uneven growth. There are stories that are meant only and purely to be enjoyed, and joy itself is political at a time when all art must be useful. What is the point of classical music? What good does a Fayyaz Khan do to a society? Why should Dastangoi be useful? Isn't it enough that it can make the audiences forget their world for an hour or two? Nevertheless, over the past years, I have used the form to create other stories. Dastangoi presentations around the partition of India and around the trial and incarceration of Dr. Binayak Sen have proved very popular. In these presentations, we sometimes use the tropes of other stories, of the traditional stories, Tilism and Ayyari, and sometimes we fashion entirely new narratives. Creating a text for Dastangoi is very different from creating a play or a story to be read. A Dastangoi narrative is meant to be performed. It acquires its unity from the performance, not from what is on the page. In addition to being performed, it may also be enjoyed as a text, but it is meant in the first instance for a vocal telling. In performance, changes of tone, of character, events, situations, everything remains under the control of the teller, which means that I can start telling a story at this point and I can stop the story any point that I want to, whether the narrative is over or not. But the point is that the performance is over. So the performance is over the moment I wrap it up. And it may leave the audiences dissatisfied, but that is a dissatisfaction over the performance, not of the narrative itself, because the narrative exists with the narrator and then it ends with the narrator. In the course of last year, I have created a Dastangoi presentation around Tagore's novel, The Home and the World, Ghore Baire, which was performed in Calcutta, Bombay and Delhi as a tribute to the 150th anniversary of Rabindranath Tagore. I used a Hindi translation and an English one to create an Urdu version where I reversed a linguistic flow which has been going on for 150 years. The purification of Urdu texts into Hindi ones, which essentially has meant removing words of Arabo-Persian origin and replacing them with Sanskritic ones. In this Dastan, I did the opposite. I removed the Sanskritic words from a Hindi text and replaced them with Urdu words. Over the last 2 years, we've also performed the famous Rajasthani folk story Chauboli, which was committed to print by the legendary folklorist Vijaydan Detha. In devising this text, I used the English translation done by Christy Merrill of this university, thus putting back into Urdu and into oral performance a text which had been translated into English from Rajasthani and Hindi, which had come into Rajasthani and Hindi from an oral performance. So there's a whole... Therefore, by using this form, we can tell stories of many different kinds. Medieval folk stories, medieval epics, modern-day novels, political stories. Everything depends on the ingenuity of the teller. But ours is a more formal art of storytelling than somebody just sitting down or standing up and telling stories. We must formalize a little. We must make the presentation ceremonial. In the last 8 years, Dastangoi has seen a fair amount of success and won many hearts. Now I would like it to move out of the comfort of a proscenium space and return to the street where it belongs. The stories are such that they can appeal to all kinds of Indians, the English-speaking as well as illiterate peasants. Now here I'm going to run away a bit, but you'll permit me, I'm sure. Also, the linguistic anarchy of North India means that a lot of our medieval literature is today lost to us. Few can understand as wonderful a text as Tulsidasa's Ramcharitmanas. Few understand Kabir's poetry. Surdasa's legendary Krishna Bhakti would today be mostly lost to us. Dastangoi has the ability to tap into these poetries and traditions and bring them alive on the stage. It can renew our acquaintance with our pasts. In times to come, I hope this dialogue with our pasts and with other inhabitants of our parts of the world will continue. The stories created by the Dastangos of the past embody an attitude to life which is now somewhat lost to us. Body, bodiness, humor, adventure, social stratification, the pre-modern gender divisions. Women have very powerful roles in these stories. Music, songs, nature, attitude to sex and religion have all undergone significant transformations in the last century and a half. The Dastans then become the repository of our past, and when presented to today's audiences, these fantasies create a narrative that is somewhat independent of modernity and yet funny and fantastic enough to appeal to us. It is a mode of entertainment that is indigenous in a very deep sense of the term. That is why it can still appeal to the classes and the masses. It is a preservation of modes of listening, reciting, regalement, and imagination that can do us a world of good. Thank you.
We're trying to process that to see if we can get it up. Do you want to wait for that, Mahmood, or-
We can talk while we... There's two things I wanted to show one was the fact that our use of gestures and our expressions to illustrate the words, and how we try and cross the linguistic barrier, because I'll actually start with the question that Farina raised about the status of Urdu in India today. So, it's the mid-20th century kind of dominance of Urdu, when Urdu writers and poets were rock stars, literally, in India. I mean, they were rock stars. I mean, they had women fans by the thousands. They were mobbed. They were celebrated. All sorts of things, and short story writers and poets. And we have enough stories about that. Urdu will never have that kind of status in India ever again. I don't think so. But Urdu has a very vital presence in the Indian oral culture, in the cinema, on the radio, in the media, in various kinds of fora. Even in, the Hindi news channels, when anyone wants to get poetic, they approximate to Urdu. So the kind of poeticness, romance and Urdu-ness are kind of so conjoined together that, it has been, I keep making this assertion that if you stop an Indian on the road and ask them to name a poet, the chances are they're likely to name Ghalib, because that's the premier poet that most Indians know about. They're not likely to know Kalidas. I'm not sure. So there is a kind of an oral culture. There is a kind of a presence to it which will remain, and in that cinema plays a very important role. Its lyrics play an important role. Radio plays an important role, and there is a very thriving now genre of Urdu in Hindi, because it's no longer possible to tag Urdu with Muslimness, because Muslims are also reading mainly Hindi. So you can go to Jama Masjid, you can go to Nizamuddin, and you will see how many religious books and guides are available in Hindi and how many in Urdu. So there is a thriving genre of Hindi in Urdu. So Urdu in Hindi. There's about a lakh of people trying to learn the Urdu script in India at any given time. So it's obviously a scenario, in a sense where, people, it enjoys immense cultural prestige. If I'm doing the same thing that I'm doing, obviously, apart from intelligibility, if I was doing the same thing in Bangla, apart from the fact that few people understand Bangla in Delhi, but it just wouldn't have that kind of status, Some of it is a kind of a nostalgic kind of a take on what the past was, what those films were, what the culture was. But some of it is a genuine interest as well. There is even the third generation Punjabi migrants in Delhi have an affinity with it because their grandfathers used to speak it. So there is various ways in which this comes in. Well, I mean, however it comes in, it's benefiting us at the moment, you know. So I don't really mind, you know. I mean, you know, so this is question sometimes asked of us, you know. Do you think? I mean, people are not understanding anything. So working. Good. Huh. Good.
So do we have sound? Do we have picture?
So we connect this one.
Okay. Well, that's ready.
So this is a kind of a 10-minute thing, which you will see. I should take this out. Wow.
Good job, Michael.
सागरे मुश्किल गिरे मस्त मारते हर तरफ चले दिन संकारते हर तरफ तेरे फैज से हूँ मैं जादू कला फसूसास मशहूर हो मेरा नाम वो फिक्रे मैं जाहिदे खुश्क को चले मैं कदे की तरफ मस्त हो मुझको साकी
This is an audience in Bombay. I mean, you know, it's not full of Urdu walas. It's just normal people, you know. I mean, normal people. You know, so but you know, the way they respond to this, you know, chale main kade ki taraf mast ho. So there is obviously something that is going through, you know. So this is Danish. He's been performing with me for the last 6 years. I mean, mainly now. It's basically Danish, and I have performed in various parts all over. I mean, Farina should have got him here as well. Next time.
नाज़रीन जो जानता है वो जानता है, जो नहीं जानता वो जान ले कि दास्तान अमीर हमजा नाम है उन दास्तानों का जिनमें अमीर हमजा अमीर बातौकीर साहिब क़िरा के कारनामे बयान किए जाते हैं। अमीर हमजा बेटे सरदारे खाने काबा ख्वाजा अब्दुल मुत्तलिब के हैं और हुजूर पाक मोहम्मद सल्लल्लाहु अलैहि वसल्लम के चचा लगते हैं और इन दास्तानों में वो मुकाबला करते हैं उन साहिरों से और देवों से और हाकिमों से और शहजादों से जो खुद को खुदा कहते हैं या झूठे खुदाओं की परस्तिश करते हैं, सच्चाई की जगह झूठ को बढ़ावा देते हैं, हक की जगह बातिल की परस्तिश करते हैं। हाज़रीन, इन मार्कों में अमीर हमजा के बचपन का साथी अमर अय्यार उनका रफीक और मददगार है। हाज़रीन, दास्तान गोई की ये महफिलें एक नजराने अकीदत उन अजीम फनकारों के नाम कि जो अदीब भी थे, अदाकार भी, जो शायर भी थे, फनकार भी, ये नजराने अकीदत सैयद मोहम्मद हुसैन जाह के नाम, अहमद हुसैन अमर के नाम, अम्मा प्रसाद रसा के नाम, शमशुर रहमान फारूकी के नाम और हजारों ऐसे दास्तान गोयों के नाम जिन्हें हमने अक्सर भुला दिया है। आज की दास्तान सैयद मोहम्मद हुसैन जाह ने बयान की थी। के अंदर चला गया और गुलशन के अंदर दाखिल हुआ, हमारे शहर इंसान बदल गया। देखा इस बात की कुछ और ही खबर है। हाज़रीन, मलका बहार इसीलिए उस बात में पहले से जाके बैठी थी। साहिर जबरदस्त है, अगर मुकाबले पर आ गया तो शहर मुकम्मल न करने देगा और अगर शहर कामिल हो गया फिर न कर सकेगा। अब चले बाप के अंदर घुसा, हवा ने मिजाज बदल दिया, बहार ने दिमाग में सौदे का खलल किया, इधर उधर घूमता हुआ बात में जो आगे गया,
बहार के शहर में गिरफ्तार और आपको नजर सामने कुर्सी पर मलका बहार पर पड़ी तो उस नौबहार अफशूं को देखकर बेकरार हुआ और ये शेर पढ़ने लगा कि बाग में उगते हैं वहां से गुले राना अब तक जिस जगह साया पड़ा तो तेरी रानाई का।
अब जो मलका बहार ने उसको शहर में गिरफ्तार देखा तो हवा में दस्तक दी। सामने बारहदरी में एक पुतली नाजुक अंदाम रश्क चमन पैदा हुई। उसके हाथ में एक संदूकचा था। संदूकचा लेके मलका बहार के पास आई। मलका बहार ने संदूकचे को खोला। उसमें से एक पुतली नारंगी रंग की बरामद हुई और बरामद होते ही पढ़कर एक माशूके शोखो शन बन गई। मलका बहार ने उस पुतली को जो काफिले जाने उशाक थी कहा, जाओ मुसफ्फिर मुर्शिदजादे वहां खड़े हैं, जाओ और उनको यहाँ ले आओ। उधर मुसफ्फिर वहां खड़ा शेरे बेताबाना पड़ता था। कहीं उसे आवाज आई, ये क्या करते हो, इधर देखो। उसने मुड़कर पीछे देखा तो उस पुतली को जो सरासर नूर थी, अजीब बल्कि हूर में कसूर होगा, वो बेकसूर थी। या तो आमादे हरफ था या उसकी निगाहे सहर आगी ने तस्खीर कर लिया। देखते ही पुकारा, एक खल्क मुंतज़िर है तेरी जलवागाह में, तारे निगाह सर्फ हुए तेरी राह में। अब मुसव्विर को ताब बाकी न रहा, वहां खड़े होकर हसरत उस नाजुक अंदाज को देखने लगा।
मलका बहार ने जब ये माजरा देखा तो मुस्कुरा के कहा, मुर्शिदजादे अगर ये कनीज को पसंद किया है तो वो आपकी खिदमत में हाजिर है, कहिए आपका इसमें क्या ख्याल है। मुसव्विर ने कहा, हाँ जी मैं इस कनीज पर आशिक। उसने फौरन कनीज को बुलाया और कहा, ऐ कनीज और हमेशा उनकी इताअत करें। कनीज ने आके हाथ पकड़ा और कहा, चलिए। बाहर ने कहा, जाइए और उसी बारादरी में रहिएगा, बाहर से ना जाइएगा कहीं। सफेद खुश खुश उस रश्के कमर पहलू में लिए बारादरी की तरफ बढ़ा। वहां आकर मसनद पे बैठा, उस नाज़नीन को अपने पहलू में लिया, जाम शराब का लबरेज करके उसके साथ मैं नौशी कर। वो इंतजार था जिसका ये।
So this is an excerpt from the partition Dastan, Dastan-e-Taqsim-e-Hind.
कौन सा उजाला दागदार हो गया है। 63 बरस हो गए। अब तो हमारे वजूद को आप कबूल कीजिए। जब बात होती है, अरे साहब दागदार उजाला, अरे दागदार उजाला, अरे मारका दुनिया रे, अरे वो हुआ था। मैं हुई थी मारका यार, पर सब लोग तो नहीं मर गए थे ना। अरे कुछ लोग तो आज भी जिंदा है ना। अभी जश्न न मनाया। क्या देखो ये हमारे साहब, ये हमारे साहब, कमाल कर रहे हो यार। आप देखे नहीं देखते आज कि हमारे पास एक के बजाय 3 मुल्क हैं, 3 कौमें हैं, 3 फौजें हैं, 3 रियासतें हैं, 3 सियासतें हैं, 17-18 सरहदें हैं, 25-30 बगावतें हैं।
सीपीए में हमने ये बुकिंग लगाई और मुंबई के ऐसे मौजूद हस्तियां हमारे सामने न बैठी और कहीं आप छन्ने वाला में हमारी गली में आ गए होते ना, तराक से उड़ा देते।
ढेर सारे सेक्युलर लोग यहाँ बैठे, उनके सामने हमें गालियां दे रहे हैं। अभी से यहाँ है तो आगे आप हमारा क्या आशा करेंगे साहब? हमें आपके साथ रहना ही नहीं है। आप हमारा हिस्सा अलग कीजिए, अपना हिस्सा अलग कीजिए, समझे? और मेरा हिस्सा मुझे दे दीजिए। आप उस तरफ रहिए। वैसे ही आप मेरे मुकाबले में 2/3 हैं, ऊपर से ज्यादा। मेरी लाइनें मार के खा जाते ऊपर से अलग।
नहीं देख साहब, ऐसे 60 साल से सेक्युलर लोगों ने आपको धोखा दिया। आपको क्या उम्मीद है कि आपका करेंगे?
मुझे आपके इस चक्कर में जंजाल में पड़ना ही नहीं है। आप अपना हिस्सा अलग कीजिए, मेरा हिस्सा अलग कीजिए। वो आपका हिस्सा, ये मेरा हिस्सा। आप खुदा इस तरफ ना आइए, मैं यहाँ की हवा में सांस लीजिए कि वो हवा आलूदा हो जाएगी।
अच्छा, आप एक बात कान खोल के सुन लीजिए कि ये चौकी अखंड है, इसका बंटवारा नहीं हो सकता।
सुन रहे हैं आप इनकी बातें, इनकी शेवें? अरे खुदारा किसी अंग्रेज को भेजिए कि वो हवाई जहाज पे उड़ के आए और हमारे दरमियान सरहद का तयन करे, वरना ये तो हमें अभी से खा जाने के लिए हो गए।